We can forgive a man for making a useful thing, as long as he does not admire it. The only excuse for making a useless thing is that he admires it intensely. All art is quite useless.
Mythology, folklore, and literature are filled with a set of recurring motifs, archetypes that reach across different periods and disparate cultures. The flood, the serpent as a figure of both wisdom and treachery, the ogre-like father figure who must be overcome before the hero can proceed, the death and rebirth of a savior. Anywhere you go, you'll find the same core elements recycled, restated. The details change to fit the history and idioms of the particular society in which the story is being told, but the essence remains the same. This is the central premise of Joseph Campbell's seminal work of comparative mythology, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. Campbell calls the basic outline of these tales the hero's journey, or the monomyth. His interest in the structure of the monomyth is not purely academic. In Campbell's mind, understanding the features of these myths and the reasons for their abiding resonance can help us to comprehend our deepest psychological and spiritual needs. The basic shape of the hero's journey goes something like this. The would-be hero is called to venture out of their familiar surroundings and into a dangerous and unknown world, often with the help of a mentor or guide. They find wonders that are both tempting and terrifying, and with the aid of supernatural forces and their own courage, they overcome a series of challenges. After defeating the forces that had opposed them, they receive a great boon, which they bring back to their home, radically transformed by their experiences. There's a bit more to it than that. Campbell spends over 400 very dense pages developing the concept, but that's the basic outline. Of course, Campbell does nothing to make the path look easy, quite the opposite. His book is an invitation, but it's also a challenge to us, his intrepid readers and would-be adventurers, to ask the truly difficult questions, to face whatever monsters lie in wait in the wilderness of our own lives, to plumb our souls and ultimately, the forces of fate willing, to find our true nature. Every hero's journey, regardless of its scope or purpose, begins with a call to adventure. The central character is drawn out of their familiar environment and must venture out into the unknown. The young Prince Siddhartha sees the ill, aging, and dead men and sets out beyond the palace walls to seek the solution to human suffering. Beowulf hears of the destruction wrought by Grendel and leaves his own kingdom to slay the monster. Neo takes the red pill from Morpheus and awakens to the truth about the Matrix. Often, the hero has no choice. The call to adventure is so compelling that it is impossible to turn down. Frodo Baggins, after discovering he is being pursued by the Black Riders, has no option but to venture out with the Ring of Power given to him by Gandalf. Luke Skywalker stumbles upon an urgent message from the Rebel Alliance. He initially resists joining Obi-Wan Kenobi on his journey, but after his aunt and uncle are killed in a raid and their home destroyed, there's nowhere for him to return to. He must press onward. In cases like these, it is clear what the character must do, at least initially. With the forces of darkness snapping at their heels, there is no choice but to cross the threshold out of their known world, to enter into new realms of mystery and danger. Fate forces their hand. But what happens when the call to adventure is not a bugle or a siren, but a faint whistle of an unclear tune? What happens when the call is quiet, cloudy, confusing, or even contradictory? When there is no mentor to show the way? Or when our would-be hero, calling upon the universe for guidance, hears only silence? I'm Greg Beam, and this is Quite Useless. Welcome to Quite Useless, a podcast about art and its role in our lives. Each episode, I take a look at a different topic in the arts, examining how art both reflects and shapes our perceptions of the world. The hero's journey may be as old as storytelling itself, but the concept, as drawn up by Joseph Campbell, has gained a lot of momentum with contemporary storytellers. Hollywood filmmakers in particular have taken Campbell's model of adventure and self-discovery and run with it, converting it from a descriptive descriptive list of features into a prescriptive model for crafting narratives that will not only entertain the audience, but resonate deeply with their desires and beliefs. It's not a coincidence that blockbusters like Star Wars, The Matrix, and even Back to the Future faithfully follow the contours of the monomyth. Filmmakers like George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, and Robert Zemeckis keep the hero with 1,000 faces on their nightstands. I don't know if this is literally true, but the point is, they lean heavily on Campbell's narrative insights, and not just through osmosis or unconscious influence. They do so deliberately. Expert filmmakers know exactly what they're doing when they introduce these elements into their stories. Some even take it too far. I found the 2013 film Gravity, though visually stunning, nearly unwatchable because of how flagrantly director Alfonso Cuarón, who co-wrote the screenplay with his son, deploys his garishly archetypal images at predictable points in the story. I laughed out loud in the theater when Sandra Bullock's character, floating unconscious in a fetal position in the womb-like space pod, appeared to have a literal umbilical cord stretching out of her belly. It was just too obvious. After all, the reason these archetypes are universal is that they issue from the deepest wells of our unconscious. This is a notion that Campbell took directly from Carl Jung. The whole idea is that we recognize them implicitly, even if we don't understand them intellectually. The language of myth is the same as the language of dreams. It may, in fact, be best if we don't consciously register what we're seeing. No one wants running footnotes to their fantasies, dreams, and repressed desires. Once you acquaint yourself with the pillars of the hero's journey, the call to adventure, the crossing of the first threshold, the mentor, the belly of the whale, the entrance into the innermost cave, etc., you can't stop seeing them. These structures and thematic elements are deeply embedded in our psyche, and they pervade our contemporary novels, films, comics, and video games. They are infused into the narratives that, like The Matrix, are all around us. Though it may not have been his intention, and while it remains annoying when adherence to the hero's journey becomes formulaic, Campbell did in fact lay out many of the basic principles of good storytelling. When a story follows the shape of the hero's journey, provided that it's well executed with meaningful content, it makes for an absorbing, inspiring, even revelatory experience. It's no wonder that billions of people arrange their ideas, their leisure time, and even their belief systems around stories that follow this pattern. But it's not my aim here to impress upon you the power of the monomyth. Instead, I want to look at what happens when something goes awry, when the hero's task is not only daunting but impossible or paradoxical, or when there is no task to be found. Difficult decisions are a hallmark of good storytelling, and it's no mystery why. We like to see characters put in situations where their desires, values, priorities, or loyalties come into conflict with one another. I talked about this a fair amount in the last episode, Boundaries. You don't have much of a narrative if your protagonist doesn't face some sort of inner or outer conflict, preferably both. Sometimes, however, a character faces a decision that is impossible to negotiate ethically or emotionally, but nonetheless must be made. This paradox lies at the heart of the Bhagavad Gita, the most famous passage of the Hindu epic, the Mahabharata. The story takes place the night before a major battle. A great warrior named Arjuna must destroy the opposing army, but in so doing, he knows that he will have to kill many of his own acquaintances and family members on the other side, a situation akin to stories of brothers killing brothers in the American Civil War. Arjuna is understandably anxious about what he must do. He stays up late consulting with his charioteer, who is a human avatar for the deity Krishna. You can imagine Krishna as roughly the Hindu equivalent of Jesus in that he's a human manifestation of the divine, except that as opposed to Christ's one-time only appearance, or 2 times perhaps, Krishna pops up fairly often. The divine charioteer advises Arjuna not to worry about the negative consequences of his actions, but to act as he must, swiftly and decisively, with crystalline focus. The Bhagavad Gita has gained traction even outside of the Hindu tradition as a reference for decisive action in the face of extreme ambivalence. This is not only because of the text's cosmological insights, but also because of its eminent practicality. What Krishna is encouraging Arjuna to do is called the yoga of action, and it has parallels to what psychologists today call flow, or being in the zone. Focus on the action itself. If you worry too much about the results of your actions, it will not only cause severe mental distress, it'll keep you from performing effectively. This basic concept runs through the writings of many of the great self-help gurus, from the Stoic philosopher Seneca to Lao Tzu, the author of the Tao Te Ching, to Sonia Lyubomirsky today. The Gita was also a touchstone for Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and Mahatma Gandhi, the last rather ironically given its unvarnished sanction of extreme violence. The situation Arjuna faces is extreme and unsettling, no doubt, but these authors read the text as an allegory, which we can relate to any situation where we might be plagued by doubt and have difficulty bringing ourselves to act. It's sort of an epic version of the Nike slogan, "Just Do It," blended with the now ubiquitous catchphrase, "Keep calm and carry on." Shakespeare's Hamlet gives us an ultra-articulate and angsty Arjuna playing charioteer to himself. Except instead of a single night, he stretches his predicament out over a couple of months, unwilling to do what he must until an exact set of conditions is met. Hamlet must first erase any lingering doubt he has of Claudius's guilt, and then Claudius must be publicly called out by Hamlet's rival Laertes, the king's to blame, erasing any doubt in anyone's mind that Claudius killed Hamlet's father. The play has remained an object of endless discussion, not so much for its ingenuity in resolving the matter, as in the Gita, but for its protagonist's prodigious capacity for describing the contours of his dilemma. But if we were to hold a competition for the most vexing call to action in the history of storytelling, that honor would have to go, I think, to the biblical tale of Abraham and Isaac. God orders Abraham to sacrifice his beloved son Isaac, the very child whom God had allowed to be born under miraculous circumstances, promising that Isaac would carry on Abraham's lineage, thus making Abraham the father of nations. I doubt that a more harrowing formulation of a self-contradictory mandate has ever been conceived. Abraham must trust God and obey his command. He is, after all, God. What God is asking Abraham to do, however, is not only stone-cold horrifying, it negates the very covenant God made with him a few years earlier. The story ushers Abraham and us into a realm where normal thinking cannot apply. As observed by Soren Kierkegaard in his brief but very challenging treatise Fear and Trembling, there is no way for reason to resolve the contradictory demands put to Abraham by God. Any action requires a leap of faith, a leap that is to a different plane of thought, a leap, in fact, beyond or outside of what we would normally call thinking. Kierkegaard envisions Abraham's ascent up the mountain being accompanied by the fear and trembling of the title. It is impossible to know if the original author saw it the same way. The relevant verses in the book of Genesis leave us largely on our own to interpret the character's response to the mind-devouring paradox set before him. Unlike Hamlet, Abraham maintains a taciturn affect, a near-total reticence about what he is being asked to do. On the 3-day hike to the mountaintop, where he is to sacrifice his son, and with him the generational legacy promised by the same God who now demands the sacrifice, his only words are, "God will provide the lamb." in response to a question put to him by the understandably bewildered Isaac, who's wondering why they're traveling up to make the sacrifice and they don't have anything to sacrifice. We don't know what Abraham is thinking or feeling, whether he is racked by doubt or possessed of a placid trust in a wisdom that transcends his own. Personally, I don't visualize the event the way Kierkegaard does. I imagine, at this moment, you must imagine, Abraham walking with a sure step, raising a steady, reassuring hand to his son. As you have tried to do over the past few days, tamping down your own fear and consternation, trying to remain a soothing presence for your wife as you try to get through this together, and to form your own covenant with the son you are about to meet, to begin your own hero's journey. Except in your case, there was no call to adventure, straightforward or ambiguous. The two of you just decided based on when you'd gotten reliable health insurance. Like tourists on safari, knowing nothing of the need that made their distant ancestors expose themselves to mortal danger, you had nothing at stake, no skin in the game, nothing on the line but the boredom of your previous life and your curiosity about what family life might be like. Silly boy. The story of Abraham and Isaac distills the paradox of a certain kind of choice down to its essence. To fulfill our spiritual potential, we must be ready to annihilate the very principle that generated that potential. In order to heed the call, we must violate our duty. If you love something, let it go. If you see the Buddha on the road, slay him. In the Christian tradition, this idea reaches its apotheosis in Christ's voluntary self-sacrifice, along with his advice to his disciples to regard the fate of their own lives similarly. As stated in the Gospel according to Matthew, "Whoever finds his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." This is a stunning contradiction, one that has been picked up, recycled, and paraphrased in many ways over the years, spun into a kind of self-help truism, often losing sight of the radical spiritual doctrine it proposes. All of these stories point to what Albert Camus calls the absurdity of our being. They resist the Enlightenment-era impulse to make sense of everything, to evade this intractable absurdity through recourse to tactical maneuvers or ethical or ideological loopholes. The character cannot be smart enough, savvy enough, or virtuous enough to solve the problem. There is no solution. They and we must live with both the absurdity of the choice that lies before them and the necessity of making a choice. The call to action in these cases is a call to stop making sense. Literary treatment of the subject of choice took an abrupt turn in the 20th century, in the West at least, as a generation of European authors, including Camus, became interested in a different predicament: the utter inability to act in a meaningful way. These authors gave us unflinching portrayals of disempowered man, impotent, adrift, stripped of the opportunity to do what Nietzsche tells us is the deepest yearning of every creature, to discharge its strength. Rather than writing about characters who have to act despite their desire not to, these authors describe characters who fervently desire to do something, but find themselves in circumstances where there are no viable options. Albert Camus gives us tales about characters awaiting death by execution or illness, as in his novels The Stranger and The Plague, or else condemned to endless, fruitless activity, as in his essay on the myth of Sisyphus. In No Exit, Jean-Paul Sartre put 3 people in a room endlessly squabbling to the point that one of them declares that hell is other people. Jean Genet offers us hopeless inmates, as in The Thief's Journal and Death Watch, as well as desperate people pointlessly acting out their fantasies as an irresistible calamity approaches, The Balcony and Splendids. Samuel Beckett picked up this strain of futility from his continental cohorts and distilled it to a clean and potent spirit, most notably in Waiting for Godot. The play is an inversion of the hero's journey, an anti-narrative populated by the bare elements of two clowns, a rock, a tree, a couple of oafish interlopers, and a savior who will not come. Beckett's characters pass the time with the daily rehearsal of trivial diversions. No other author has so keenly trolled through the standing water of the soul in wait. The opening lines of the play encapsulate the absurdist perspective. An old tramp named Estragon, unable to remove his boot, says, "Nothing to be done." His companion, Vladimir, replies, "I'm beginning to come round to that opinion. All my life I've tried to put it from me, saying, 'Vladimir, be reasonable. You haven't tried everything.' And I resumed the struggle." The rest of the play is an unpacking of that stunning premise. Our lives, all too often, are the unpacking of that premise. The most obvious ancient precursor to these 20th century works is the biblical Book of Job, in which the title character, deprived of home, wealth, health, and family, has no choice but to submit to the will of God, no matter how capricious or unjust God's will may seem to him. There really is nothing to be done for Job. But even Job comes nowhere near the flat, chilly desolation expressed in the absurdist canon. Although there's nothing to be done, there is nonetheless movement in Job's world. He finds himself at the mercy of a divine cosmic order that is either unknown or horrifying to him, but it is a divine order nonetheless. In the end, Job's faith and fortitude are repaid in abundance. This kind of redemption would be anathema to the mid-20th century European writer. For Beckett, Sartre, Genet, Camus, there is no descent into hell and triumphant reemergence with the souls of the damned. There is no reward for patience and purity. There is only a dreary, endless, dully aching purgatory. You write this in the waiting room of the labor and delivery unit at New York Methodist Hospital, where it is difficult to understand the intake protocols and the staff are always changing, each tired, well-meaning face bringing with it a different account of your prospects for getting a room tonight. The word purgatorial indeed comes to mind. One of the great dangers of being in wait is that the desire to act, the feeling that you need to do something right now, never really leaves you. It often takes hold of you and makes you do things you know you will regret. It is the restive actions we do when there is nothing to be done that often spell trouble. This is the sinkhole in which we dump both our resources and the goodwill of those around us. Making ill-advised overtures and outcries, rash actions we would probably avoid if we possessed the clarity that legitimate options provide. This is the reason that patience is a virtue. At times like this, the wisest and the hardest thing to do is often nothing at all. Here in the waiting room, stuck for hours, there is little to do but listen to the cries of the women waiting to get out of triage. Your thoughts turn to all the blunders you've ever made in your life. The missed opportunities, the bad ones taken, the times you should have stuck it out or those when you should have moved on, the people you should or shouldn't have given the benefit of the doubt, the thousands of hours you should have spent doing X instead of Y. And as you reflect, though most of this itself is reckless self-recrimination, there is one nub of truth you settle on. As you reflect, you find that most of the worst decisions you ever made came in periods of waiting. times when you felt that you needed to do something. There was nothing to be done, but that wasn't enough to stop you, so you would do something foolish and often harmful. Make that impulse buy on Amazon. Reply to that obnoxious comment on Facebook with an even more obnoxious comment, tomorrow's embarrassment be damned. Break up with that girlfriend, kill that friendship, move to Hollywood. By God, just do something. It's too excruciating to just sit here and wait. I'm not sure why waiting became a topic of such particular concern for European authors of the 40s and 50s. Perhaps it was because they had experienced foreign occupation. Their concern doesn't seem to have been shared, at least not so keenly, by American writers of the same period, who were more concerned with the American mythos as reflected in various contemporary political and social issues. Kerouac expressed a philosophical sympathy with the French existentialists, but this has always struck me as unconvincing. The Beats were always so energetically going after something, pursuing authentic experience out there, heeding the call to adventure, you might say, whether or not one was actually issued. Perhaps the European fascination with waiting had something to do with the nationalist juggernauts that threatened the author's existence, both personally and culturally. Perhaps the good people of Europe's inability to stop the inexorable goose-step of fascism undermined the very notion of meaningful action. Perhaps people felt, as never before, that there really was nothing to be done. There's going to be more of this. People are going to become interested in the theme of waiting once again as we realize what the hours we spend on social media and staring at our tablets and smartphones really represent. Those hours wasted on trivialities stand for the bereavement of our autonomous power, our complicity in the negation of the individual will. Those hours mean that tsunami-like societal forces shall determine the course of our lives to an extent that we are either unable to perceive or unwilling to admit. Those hours mean that we pass our days under the illusion of choice, waiting for the next big thing to come along and steer us this way or that. Except we don't even realize that we're waiting because we always seem to be so busy. Every moment that we're not working, filled with stimulation and diversion. We are in the process of negating the very principle of waiting, and in so doing, we are fulfilling its terrible potential. We can't claim that no one saw this coming. Neil Postman tried to warn us back in 1985 in his book Amusing Ourselves to Death. Postman argues that, in spite of our hand-wringing about authoritarianism and fascism, the approaching cultural apocalypse may resemble Aldous Huxley's Brave New World more than George Orwell's 1984. Oppression in the form of pharmaceutical narcotizing and mind-numbing entertainment, a theme notably picked up by David Foster Wallace in his novel Infinite Jest. Huxley himself, in the retrospective essay Brave New World Revisited, describes our infinite appetite for distractions as an existential threat to human flourishing because of its ability to be exploited by any party with the appropriate will and resources. In a letter to Orwell following the publication of 1984, Huxley praises the book but maintains that Orwell's nightmare of the future is likely to modulate to his own. A future in which we are so mesmerized by our gurus and our gadgets that we don't even notice when the final revolution arrives. We're just too damned distracted. All because of the accrual of moments in which we couldn't bear not to pull that thing out of our pockets, when we couldn't just sit and wait patiently. Blaise Pascal may have been all too right when he wrote that all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. Except that Pascal didn't actually write that, not quite. The paraphrase that has become so popular on social media is itself a symptom of our general impatience, the full aphorism asks a bit more of the reader, not a whole lot more, but enough to make it unmemely. Maybe the simple threat of boredom, the threat of having to wait without amusement, is the vortex of dissatisfaction that drives all our economic engines, poisoning our atmosphere and suffocating our oceans. Maybe this will be our downfall. Yet it is the prospect of remission from our boredom that itself makes the waiting unbearable. Entertainment, diversion, distraction, these are the real threats. Pascal had a lot to say about the dangers of diversion, writing in his Pensées that while diversion is the only thing that consoles us from our miseries, it is itself the greatest of our miseries. It is, as the eminent cultural critic Homer Simpson once described alcohol, the cause of and solution to all our problems. For it is diversion, Pascal assures us, which principally hinders us from reflecting upon ourselves, and which makes us insensibly ruin ourselves. Without this, we should be in a state of weariness, and this weariness would spur us to seek a more solid means of escaping from it. But diversion amuses us and leads us unconsciously to death. Waiting itself, then, is not the real danger. In fact, it may present a means of escape or transcendence. It is our inability to wait that invites disaster. Our insistence on fleeing from the present moment by drawing the past or the future closer to us. Or worse, our flight from the past, present, and future by means of entertainment, the nowhere land of the mind. You think about all this as you gaze at the wallpaper peeling off the walls of the waiting room and try not to look at your phone for the 500th time. You contemplate Kafka, the implacable inhumanity of institutional protocols. You think about something you wrote in your journal last week and turned into a lame blog post, something pretentious with persistent references to Epictetus, about turning every situation into an occasion to practice some skill or virtue. You practice patience through the long hours in the waiting room, the hours in triage, the third day in a row spent in this place of white walls, electronic sounds, and furtive looks. You practice patience through your elliptical conversations with the doctors and nurses when really you just want to scream, "What the hell is going on?" You tell yourself that everyone you meet is a kind and reasonable person. They too are burdened by the disorders of the system they are forced to operate under. No one wants it to be this way. No one did this on purpose. That's just the indifferent logic of the machine. You remind yourself how, driving here this morning, you said that you were going to approach this whole thing with a positive attitude. You breathe deeply as you're sent home for the third night in a row, as your wife's OBGYN tells her over the phone that he would have put his fist through the wall if he'd been in your shoes, as you can't sleep and find yourself writing more of this down, the clock ticking past 2 in the morning, sleep not coming. Will it ever come again? You practice patience because you know that you're going to need it. You know that when you get up in the morning and the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that, and the day after that, long after the baby is born and you've settled into this new phase of your life, whatever unpredictable things come your way, the one thing that is sure to await you is more waiting. Waiting for a call that never seems to come, wondering if the universe has somehow lost your number. The endless anticipation of the actual. Not even an adventure, just an event, a moment even. Something you can hold up and say, this. Just this. Look. Here it is. Because for every hero who successfully heeds the call, there are so many of us wondering and wishing, endlessly waiting for someone to come along and say, "Come with me, and I will show you who you truly are." This episode of Quite Useless was produced by me with help from my brother Mike, who wrote the music you heard. This is the final episode of the first season of Quite Useless. I'm going to be putting out a handful of short episodes as I gather material together for season 2, which I'm hoping to release later on this year. Provided I don't get too distracted by whatever happens to pop up on my smartphone. In the meantime, if you want to keep up with how things are developing, our website is thisisquiteuseless.com. You can email us at quiteuselesspodcast@gmail.com and find us on Facebook and Twitter. I'm Greg Beam, and I very much hope you will heed the call and join me next season as I embark on more Quite Useless adventures.